Okay, well, first of all, I'd like to welcome everybody. We are so delighted to have you here. We really appreciate your time and interest. We are I'm Joanna Will, by the way, I work for the Kansas Rural Center. We're very happy to be able to offer this SARE track at our conference. It's always a real treat to hear what farmers and ranchers and researchers have been up to in their work. There's always so many great and compelling projects, and we just feel delighted to be able to share those with you and also to learn about them for ourselves. This track is sponsored by the North Central Region SARE. That's a 12-state region. And SARE is the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program. And for the 12-state region, I believe they've put out $40 million worth of grants over the years to farmers and researchers and or ranchers and others, to do amazing projects that forward sustainable ag practices. So we're just thrilled. So we've got two speakers today. Our first speaker will be Pantaleon Flores, and I will let him introduce himself and his project. We're thrilled to have him and very excited. Turn it over to you.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, my name is Pantaleon Flores. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the owner-operator of Masewal Kwali Farms, which is a Nahuatl word which translates into the people's farms. So the farm, just a little background on it, it's a no-till, no fossil fuel farm that also does a lot of work within the realm of food security, that is trying to also work towards food sovereignty. So that's just kind of why the people's farms, why Masewal Kwali Farms. The no fossil fuel component of the farm is really important for the framework of the research that was done. So I'll be talking about my SARE report that I have on ancestral Mexica farming or ancestral Mexican farming. I prefer to use the term Mexica for myself, self-identifying that way. But yeah, so the research was a really amazing opportunity from SARE. And I kind of wanted to start talking about the research by talking about the way that SARE is actually set up. So I have a background of a master's in curriculum development and programmatic evaluation. And so I kind of look at, with the study behind me, look at SARE as a whole, as an organization, how the actual metrics and things of it work. SARE is really accessible in terms of everything else that I've ever seen from the USDA. So I really do like to make sure that people know that part of it. It's one of the most approachable things that I've found from the USDA as far as access goes. And then also just compared to other grant opportunities and other institutional opportunities or offerings, you really get to do what you want to do down to everything. You don't have an institutional oversight on you saying, okay, well, we still need to fit in with the framework of the way that certain institutions work and operate, which isn't always good. And so this really allows you to fully do your research as you see fit. And to really empower farmers like that is amazing just in and of itself. But then, when you get BIPOC candidates, so Black, Indigenous, and candidates of color, people of color like myself, you are really empowering a lot through an institution, the USDA, that has historically been incredibly systemically racist towards people like myself and other BIPOC. And so I really do appreciate all the work that SARE is doing. I see the way that they're actually, the way that the programs actually pan out, and it seems and feels pretty equitable. And I hope we can get more and more information on how equity really is working within SARE, because I think it would be, just from intuition, I think it would show a really good model for the USDA and how they can get better with equity moving forward. But yeah, so let's just dive into the research after that piece. The research was comparing cultivation methods pretty specifically. So cultivation methods of corn. I guess I kind of have to backtrack a bit here too. So I was living in Berkeley, South Berkeley, California, I had the best access to ancestral knowledge I've ever had in my life. I grew up here in Kansas. The libraries here don't have nearly the amount of culturally relevant information in them. When I lived out there for 3 years, I was able to access a lot of this like ancestral knowledge that's actually firsthand accounts of different like codexes. And it really allowed me to see my people from the lens of my people and not through a conquistador lens or a Spaniard lens or a European lens of any kind, which is really important, especially if you're thinking anthropologically. But one of the ones that came up for me was called the Florentine Codex. So that's this one here, the Florentine Codex. It's I think a 12 or 14 book series. Book 11 is the one that was really particular to the research because it detailed exactly how to cultivate maize, how to cultivate corn. And so it really went step by step throughout all of the growing phases of the corn to show you how to cultivate and to pass that knowledge on. And that was actually written of indigenous account again. So it's not filtered through any kind of European lens. Which we're incredibly biased. That's why I keep saying that for anyone who hasn't heard anything about that yet. Those lenses were incredibly biased and meant to paint a specific narrative for conquest. That's why they were called conquistadors. So the Florentine Codex had all the information I needed to really connect with my ancestors and see how they grew like one of our staple crops. That research, kind of along with my no-till background led me to question like, okay, these are definitely different than like a standard no-till where you have like a seed drill that can be on a tractor or not. I used a jab planter, so I have no fossil fuel machinery use on my farm. So I didn't use a tractor. I don't use tractors, but I used a jab planter to kind of simulate that same kind of just seed drill, plant harvest, that kind of like conventional no-till system. And then I also used on the other half of the samples, I used the instructions from the codex, which essentially tell you, you have to have a very good seed selection. So the instructions talk about seed selection. It's very important. They talk about how, mounding at various stages of growth in the plant are really important. There is one mention of when to also sow beans along with it. I know we talked about Three Sisters and one of the other in just the previous keynote. But I didn't include that piece because I was really only looking at cultivation and really trying to compare side by side just the cultivation methods. And so I decided, okay, I'll use these instructions, do an analysis that compares them. And then it came down to seed selection, right? Seed selection was such an important part of that codex that I actually reached out to the North Central Regional Plant Introduction Station up in Ames and was able to get a couple different varieties of Mexican corn from that research seed vault, essentially. And had I not had the SARE research, I don't know if I would have been granted the seeds from the seed vault. I'm not sure on that. I can't say. I do know some people who don't have SARE grants who have actually just recently received seeds for research purposes. So I think maybe I still could, but I know the SARE aspect of it certainly helped. The couple that I used for this actual project, there is one from Guanajuato, which is where my great-grandfather came from. So I got a variety from there. And then I also got one from Michoacan. I also wanted something from a very, drastically different environment. If you think of Guanajuato, you're thinking more central highlands, like dry farming, that kind of style. You're down in Michoacan, you're practically like tropical. So you've got a really long season, really humid. So that's going to impact how, those seeds react to an environment, just like the arid dryland style in Guanajuato that you might find in Guanajuato. So I use those two. I realized that the economic component of my SARE research project wouldn't have worked if I didn't use a sample that wasn't from the seed bank, because you actually can't consume anything that's of the next generation directly from the seed bank. And I didn't know that until I got the seeds and had the information in it, which is also probably me missing something on the website I probably should have known. But I decided to just go ahead and get some organic Jerry Peterson blue corn and use that as the third sample within the research. So I had 3 samples. I had the Guanajuato, the Michoacan, and then the organic Jerry Peterson blue corn, because I am a farmer. I do try and survive off of farming to some extent. I wanted to sell it also to restaurants so that people could experience that kind of crop, which I'll get to a little bit later. So that season came along. I was incredibly fortunate to have 2 undergraduate researchers with me on that project. So Paula Ramirez and Ashley Aranda, like they are like the best thing about the entire project. So I don't want to speak too much on their ethnographic reports, because we didn't just do qualitative science, we also did, or quantitative science, we did qualitative stuff too. And their ethnographies, like, I can't do justice at all. Like, they're the best part of that entire report. So I'm going to leave that giant, massive cliffhanger and tell you to go read their ethnographies if you haven't yet, because they're truly amazing. I'm really happy to have them on the project. One of the other economic components for me with the SARE report, or the SARE project, was to be able to pay people well. So I farm by myself because I can't afford to hire anyone at a rate that I feel comfortable with, or ethically comfortable with. The SARE project allowed me to pay them $18 an hour, which enabled them as undergrads to drop some of the other, wage hour, hourly work that they would have had otherwise had to pick up, and forego studies, or living their life, because they're human beings. So that helped a lot as well, to be able to pay them at a rate that is respectable. And that's another component of the SARE thing that I liked a lot. But so I got the seeds. I got an amazing crew. We got some really great tools with the SARE grants. Another part about my farm is that it is on city/county land. And so I lease the land that I'm on right now. And there are a couple other people who lease the 6-acre site. We have our own individual plots, down to, I think, 1/4 of an acre, up to somebody has like 1.5 acres. But the tools that I got from having the SARE grant, I was able to then, make communal tools for everybody. So everyone then had access to that. So not only did the research crew have access to those tools, that automatically enabled access to like 5 other beginner farmers, to all the tools that we got with that grant. Have an amazing crew, some great tools for me and other beginner farmers who weren't even directly linked to the project right out of the gate. We have a really torrentially rain-filled season. So we got lots and lots of flooding. The Michoacan sample actually was like complete crop failure, because it was in just the worst of it. It just got the worst of it. I was able to save about 600 seeds off of what was salvaged out of that plot. And so there's still Michoacan seeds. So that sample wasn't completely wiped away. There's still a next generation of seeds. The blue corn, actually, the ancestral population produced 2.6% more than the conventional no-till. So it actually did show a little bit of an increase there. The Guanajuato sample actually showed 6.7% more on yield. And so that's statistically significant, that's 6.7% is like, we definitely want to replicate this just to see how that goes. And I kind of had like an order for this, but I want to go ahead and introduce this. So this is actually the third generation of the Guanajuato sample. And so it's doing really, really well. It's taking a break from growing this season, but the seed selection on it has been really interesting to do. And I definitely want to replicate the research and do the mounding and all that stuff again for next season. But this season it's kind of taking a break, but that's kind of like, fast forwarding to where we are right now with the research. Got this Guanajuato one. I'm kind of trying to seed select to be able to have lavender colored masa. So, we were talking about specialty crops and the other speaker, and to be able to make lavender masa would just be really cool. And to be able to do it just like, you know, I shuck this whole thing, the ratio of it is just ready to become that color, would be amazing. Because you can do it. I make lavender, you can make lavender masa. You get blue corn masa and you get white corn masa, and you get a good enough ratio, you'll have a really beautiful lavender tamale, which I suggest everyone try making dessert tamales with, because they're really pretty and delicious. Dessert tamales. We'll get to food here in a minute too. But yeah, so that's where this research is right now, from where it came with SARE. That's kind of like the hard science side of things. The other side of stuff that I wanted to talk about was the social impact. Another component that SARE really focuses on, and I think is super important, is what is the social impact of the research that you're doing. The project reached about 818 people at the time when we submitted the report, the second time, I think. And so that reached people in a lot of different ways. It reached people through community meals. So, you know, I made esquites as a side dish, which is like a roasted corn and cheese dish. And it made its way into pozole for community meals, made its way into pozole on restaurant plates. I did a pop-up with a restaurant down on Mass Street, which is our big restaurant street here in Lawrence, and made tamales out of 100% farm masa that I nixtamalized myself, ground myself, and made just completely by hand. And that was something really special for me, to be able to bring that completely, like, from seed all the way to that point of every piece of that really ancestral process of nixtamalization, which for folks who don't know, is the process of actually making corn digestible and bioavailable to your body. When Europeans first exported corn from here, they actually contracted a lot of diseases, that one specifically being pellagra, because they're all becoming B vitamin deficient, I think is the layman way to say that. I'm not 100% on that science, but became B deficient in B vitamins because the corn without the nixtamalization process was robbing their bodies of that vitamin. And so they got pellagra, and lots of people died, actually. So knowing these ancestral processes is super important. And it was, for me, really important to be able to go from seed to like I said, every single step of that ancestral process. In addition to the corn that was produced and the food that was produced just from the corn product, there was also some huitlacoche, which is a corn fungus, or I think some people in English call it corn smut, which makes it sound really delicious, I know. But it is probably one of the best things I've ever tasted in my entire life. And I have a very adventurous palate. Like, I like to eat a lot of things, a lot of different things, but I describe it as the sweetest sweet corn you've ever had crossed with a truffle. And so it's not quite as truffle intense, but flavor wise, that's definitely there. It is a fungus, but me and the researchers, we did find a small amount of that, which is actually the picture that I posted on the report cover, is of huitlacoche. But that was another social impact for us, because none of us had ever had it fresh like that. And for us as Mexica people, like all three of us Mexica people, were just like, we've never had that fresh before, never had access to it. And then, it was there while we were doing this research, and it felt very profound. And it was a really good meal. We ended up making empanadas out of it. Super, super delicious. Definitely, if you can find it anywhere, definitely try it. Another social impact of this work was the reclamation work that it allowed us to do for ourselves as people of color and as people indigenous to this side of the world. It put this back into my hand, right? I know I had to go through an institution to do it. I wish that it wasn't quite as rigid as there has to be a science report in order for us to release this seed that's ancestral to you. And I wish it wasn't set up that way. And I think there's room for that to expand to people who genuinely want to reconnect with their roots, should have access to their ancestral crops, period. Pretty much everywhere on Earth, other than around Europe, came up with agriculture, thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, about 5,000 years before Europe did. And here I sit juxtaposed with white institutions that continue to gatekeep things like this that are super important to us and that are parts of us. There are parts of my ancestors in this. This came from where they came from. This came from them. That's what that means. And so I think the social impact that I want to continue to fight for is our access to this. Because it's so much more important than just like, oh, well, what science thing are you doing? It's like, well, the beautiful social science thing of reclaiming our work, and reclaiming, our work, our people's work. So seed reclamation was a huge thing for me on that. I am also trying to work towards being seed sovereign, which means saving seeds so that I don't have to continue to buy from structures that harm a lot of people. So another piece in social aspect to this was healing. So it was trying to find space right? In that sense of like away from things that are typical and that are currently hegemonic and dominant. And really revealing wounds that we had, because there was a really big growing piece to me and the team throughout this project. And that was like some of the best work out of the whole thing, honestly. I know a piece of Paula's reclamation work was being able to, talk with her sister while planting their garden after this research study, telling the stories, and then also going back home to Mexico and telling her grandma about it. So like that went like every direction of time. It didn't just like look forward. No, like it looked back. It was balanced. It went everywhere. It was here, it was now, it was there, then. And I really love that component of it as well. And we also gave each other space to grow. We took time, when we came to components and aspects of the project that were difficult. And we didn't push ourselves to the point of, like overexhaustion, like most farmers do. Like I do. Still, I try to avoid it, and I try to do less of that, but still. So the project had a massive social impact. One that I didn't fully write, or really hardly write at all, into my own personal ethnography, just because I wasn't personally ready yet. But one that Ash and Paula definitely did. So like I said, go read their ethnographies. It's the best thing in the entire report, for real. How am I doing on time? Do I have, what are we?
Yeah, go ahead, Caitlin.
Oh, you have a few more minutes, and then if you want questions, we'll have a few minutes after that for questions.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think I'll keep going a little bit. So yeah, I mean, the other piece of it that we kind of, not retrospectively, but like kind of actively throughout the whole thing, we're realizing also that we already knew our entire lives, was how systematically we are separated from this work, and how deep that actually is. Like, it's so much deeper even than just not having land access. Like, so we had land access, right? During that piece. We had the land access still. And Ash and Paula talk about this in their own ethnographies. We also then, re-revealed wounds that we have disproportionately, like health disparities. And so, when we're out in the field, it's like, okay, cool, we have the land access, but still we are systematically like in health despair, literally. That's what that means. And how that translated into like our ability to connect with nature just unveiled a whole nother level of why all of the systems that are around us and that we're forced to fight through are just in need of something completely different. And we had time, and this was the best part of that. It sounds like completely horrible thing like to think about, but like we had time to really sit even deeper on that for ourselves. And that was, that was some really, really healing cultural, spiritual work just in and of itself with that part. I don't want to give away too much more of what they talk about, because obviously that's more their story to tell. And I really want y'all to definitely read that report. But so socially that was deep. Like economically it was great. I was like, cool, I got to, cook it for myself in a restaurant and sell to people and tell people these things. But that social component and then those community meals, I think were some of the biggest pieces to come out of that, because I'm also a cook. I've only professionally cooked for like a couple years, but I've cooked like my entire life. So that was kind of important for me too, but nothing really compares to the reclamation work. And it's also kind of why I said in the very beginning, like, I feel like SARE really does allow you to just like do the exact work that you want to do. And when I submitted that report, I had hesitations because it had USDA on it, and a lot of BIPOC farmers have that for very clear historical reasons. And I was like, you know what? Honestly, if they don't want me to do it like I want to do it, need to do it culturally relevantly, then I don't want anything from them. And so like that was my attitude going into it. That's my attitude moving forward on any institutional opportunity. And I'm happy that SARE is open to just letting people really do their work. Like that's so important, and sounds so baseline and so just basic, but it's so incredibly important to work like this. So I do want to make sure we've got some time for questions. So I think I might go ahead and just stop that part there. If anybody's got any questions.
Thank you so much. What a really compelling and fabulously interesting project and report and presentation. I can't wait to go read the report. And Caitlin has dropped the report, a link to the report into the chat. And so if you have a minute, go into the chat and you can download that now so you can save it and have it to read later. Yes. Hi, Joan. Did you have questions or comments?
Yeah, well, I have had the opportunity to read the report, and so because I coordinate the farmer rancher grants, but it is a very moving report, and I do recommend people go out and read it. It's a wonderful project, and I really appreciate the work you did on that, Pantaleon. Thanks,
Joan. And we
can you tell me where you're going forward with this now? You know, where do you hope to take it now?
I mean, I think next year it's about replication of the original study, because I like I said, I did take a little bit of a break to try some other varieties of corn. Like this year I'm growing a red pozolero, so it's more for hominy and for, you know, it's a much bigger corn. It's literally like a 14-foot, 16-foot tall corn. And so I also kind of took this year to kind of just like hold off on it, just to think on it and to really like reflect on how the initial study went, think about really actually be able to think through some things in the winter, you know, if we ever get to those kind of things. But yes, I mean, the work is kind of like, it's morphing for sure. It's definitely changing. I do want to replicate, but right now in this year, I'm really mostly more interested in varieties that have, this is kind of something I did mean to talk on a bit, but that have the, I think it's a bacterial, what is I can't remember the scientific term for it, but there's a bacterial kind of slime or gel on aerial roots of corn that actually fixes nitrogen. And I saw an article in the Smithsonian that kind of naively was like, there's this one variety in Michoacan, this was 2 years ago, mind you, one variety in Michoacan that can fix nitrogen. And I was like, I've been observing that since I was a child. And so like the nitrogen fixing corn really kind of like, once I saw it on another corn, remembered like I'd seen that so many years before, kind of did a little research on it, made me kind of veer off of taking a break from the comparative analysis. But it definitely, you know, doing this study and doing this helped me, not that I hadn't done research studies before or written anything before, but it definitely helped me improve and focus on being able to replicate and sit back and think about them instead of just kind of like continuing to push forward through things, which I think is super important for the way I want to do my work. But yeah, so it's I guess to answer your question, it's changing a lot. It still is rooted a lot in this original study, and I definitely want to replicate that and see where that goes.
Thank you.
Great. All right, are there any more questions?
Oh, I did see one in the chat. Thoughts on expanding your growth on corn smut. So that one, is a tricky thing for folks to cultivate. The spores remain in your soil, I think, for like 3 to 5 years, I believe, and it isn't the most predictable. I know there's some people in much more humid, hotter, longer season environments. I think I heard of a guy in Florida who was like able to spread enough spore and kind of cultivate it. I know that, a lot of it's probably coming from Mexico because, there's just massive plantings of corn, and then you go through and you find it. That's kind of the cultivation method from what I know, at least. But yeah, that one, I haven't really thought about it. I kind of think I just want it to exist as something when it wants to and does, as opposed to something that I would want to cultivate. It speaks, I think, more to like my personal and like indigenous cultivation of that. So I wouldn't really be such an active cultivator. I'd rather that just kind of like be where it is and when it is.
I see, Beth, you have your hand raised. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on something you said about the nitrogen fixing corn. So we actually have an active SARE research and education project on that now in Wisconsin. So the nonprofit doing it is the Monoman Project. And Walter is working primarily with indigenous tribe, so Native American or American Indian tribes in the northern part of the state. So I will send you the link to that. You'd be interested to read what he's doing with that as well.
Definitely. Yes, thank you.
And he'd love to talk to you as well, I'm sure. So that would be great.
Yeah, because there are a couple samples that I'm looking at this season. One is a high altitude Peruvian purple corn, and it's definitely putting out gel. And there's a lot of speculation I have on that is, like it's way up there in very shallow soil with a more nitrogen rich atmosphere. It's probably gonna try to take from the air. So I definitely want to read that and follow up and work with you all. It'd be cool.
All right, are there any other questions? Well, in that case, I think we will say thank you again so much, and we will shift gears now to Nicholas Ward, who is going to talk about his project with worms.
Well, greetings to you all, and thank you to KRC for allowing me to share a bit about my time working with Lawrence Worm Farm here in Lawrence. My name is Nicholas Ward, and I'm here presenting to you today about Lawrence Worm Farm Sustainability and Food Waste Reclamation. This was a vermicomposting education and food waste mitigation program that I had the pleasure of leading from roughly the fall of 2016 through the spring of 2018. Pictured here in this slide with young curious students at Cordley Elementary in Lawrence as we explore learning about worms and inspect the rate at which they are consuming lunchroom waste. Youthful curiosity and a propensity for meddling. My initial curiosity for doing this type of work began as a young adult living in an apartment back in 2014. I knew that I wanted to compost my food waste, but there was no way to do so with the restrictions of living in rented housing. It was an apartment. Around the same time, I learned about composting with worms and thought I would give it a try since it was a practice that could be conducted indoors. And so, Caitlin, we should be on slide 3 now. I had done enough research to know about a few different kinds of worms, and I started my farm with 2 pounds of red wigglers. These worms were ordered online from Uncle Jim's Worm Farm. And being unsure of how this effort would work out, I opted for creating my own DIY worm bins, like you see here, instead of purchasing bins. Variations on instructions for this type of worm bin can be found all over on the internet. It's fairly easy and straightforward building process, but to be honest, the professional worm bins sold online make the experience a bit easier and more friendly for the beginner. Next slide. There are numerous videos online about amateur worm farming. Like any other media, some of this is well-researched, scholarly, and helpful, and some of it has a bit of misinformation attached. As a responsible worm farmer, I did some digging and was able to find 2 books that would provide me with a stable base for the work that I would be doing with worms. The first pictured here is Mary Applehoff's Worms Eat My Garbage, and a great little illustration of her from the book. Next slide. And the second is Worm Cafe, Mid-Scale Vermicomposting of Lunchroom Waste by Benet Payne. These books offer a range of information from technical advice to more humanistic considerations of inclusion, participation, and partnership when working as a guest in collaboration with lunchroom staff and in schools. While I eventually found many texts to pull from, it is these 2 texts that were the most helpful. I highly suggest them, both of them, for anyone aspiring as a worm farmer. Next slide. Prior to applying for and receiving the SARE Farmer Rancher Grant, I initiated the Lawrence Worm Farm program with the 497 school district in Lawrence, by partnering with a number of thoughtful and caring teachers. Together, we, and this is including Julie Schwarting, Perry Kennard, Samantha Saltz, Jessica Sadler, Alicia Cole, Denise Johnson, Beverly Hyde, and others. These are teachers. We co-wrote a series of grants to the Kansas Department of Health and Environment through a program called Kansas Green Schools. I worked directly with these teachers, lunchroom staff, and school administrators to develop programs and curriculum that would work well for each school. Each school had very different considerations. Karen Lowman at KDHE was a huge support to the effort. Karen, for anyone who might know her on here, made this possible through her availability and general support as an administrator of the Kansas Green Schools program. Next slide. Shortly after I began working in schools, my name quickly changed from Nicholas to the more formal and predictable Mr. Nicholas, and eventually to the extremely formal Hey Worm Guy. To this day, I still encounter kids and parents around town who refer to me as the Worm Guy, for better or worse. Here, I'm just in Caitlin, next slide. We should be seeing 3 teachers here. I'm just showing you a few of the folks that I worked with, cafeteria staff. And this is based on the book by Benet Payne and work I had done as a community organizer, that instead of going directly, next slide, to the administration, I started first by talking to cafeteria staff and by talking to teachers and janitors about how this program could potentially work for them or not work for them, what they would need to see from it to make it be successful for them, and also find out if they just weren't interested, because the reality is that without them getting any extra pay, this program that I was introducing was going to bring about extra workload. All of them, in the end, were very excited about it and were happy to participate. It helped create a stronger relationship between students and cafeteria staff. They were all in on a program together. And it just was a successful model, I think, where they were, the idea of them working together on something was really great. Next slide. Here you can see a teacher, Perry Kennard. He's actually, I think, the one teacher who, even now in 2021, which is 3.5 years later, the worm bins that we constructed at his school and the program that we developed is still running. We actually refined the model because he was the last school to get on there at Southwest Middle School. And instead of doing kind of a full school program implementation for the composting of food waste, we started with just 6th graders, and that allowed us to kind of step the process. So the 6th graders learned 1 year, and then the next year, those 6th graders taught the new 6th graders, and on and on and on until eventually everyone in school was aware of the process and the program. Next slide. This should be slide 12. Here you can see students talking to cafeteria administration. And so this is where we had gone through, we had done some basic education about composting and food waste, and I'll show you a little bit of that here in a minute. But the students made some of their own considerations and objectives with the work and the learning we were doing, and they decided that we needed to figure out exactly what was happening to the food in the school. And so they were proposing here a food waste audit. Here you can see one of the principles. This is fascinating to me. Something I had not considered, but when kindergartners enter school, they actually have to go through an education program on how to be a good lunch participant. And so they learn about trays, they learn about where the food goes on their trays. This is adorable and probably a really messy experience for the administrators because there's, maybe 60 kids taking part in this all at once. But we use this as an opportunity to also teach about which foods were able to be composted, which foods would go to the landfill, which things could be recycled. So a part of that education process is we learn a little bit about the food chain, just some really basic stuff, just to make sure that everybody, it could be redundant, but to make sure that everybody has kind of the same footing in the work that we're preparing to do. Here's another example of that, these fun illustrations that I've, honestly using for kindergartners and high schoolers, the same materials mostly. And then some other information. So learning that about 21% on average of the waste that's being generated and going into our landfills is food waste. So this is something that the youth were, they found baffling, and it really made them think a little bit more about what they were doing with their lunch and how much of it they were discarding. And this, again, this is kind of a generalized number here, but 35 to 45% of food overall in general is wasted each year. And this is not specific to lunchrooms, but this is starting at the level of where food is grown, what does not or is not able to be harvested, what is lost in transport, what is lost in things being refrigerated, what doesn't make it through the store, all the way to what the end consumer is doing in food that is being thrown away, like we'll see here pretty soon at the schools. And so this number, I think, is what really prompted the high school students to propose that we do a food waste audit. And here again is another picture where you can see this is a young woman actually proposing the waste audit and us having a discussion about it. This is at Free State High School. So the waste audit, we begin. What does this look like? It looks like we're auditing waste. So there's a lot of garbage cans that we're taking. We did one day at each school for the initial audit. And what this meant was we took everything that was thrown away from lunch periods. And sorry, Caitlin, we should be on slide 19 now. And this is slide 20. We're on slide 20 now. This is what the food waste looks like. So we've poured all of this out and we're looking at it here, and it's kind of a mess. So we're seeing things that could be recycled, mixed with things that could be composted, mixed with things that should definitely just be going to the landfill. Next slide. Here's another look at it. And next slide, slide 22. Here you can see the students. We spend an afternoon, probably till about 5:30 after school, going through the day's waste and separating it into buckets for what could be composted, what was actually going to the landfill, and what would be recycled. And it was really fascinating. Next slide. And here you can see the same process being done with kids that are in grade school. Next slide. And here's another example of that. So when it got down to things like peas and carrots and corn, we're actually scooping that up with our hands, wearing gloves, of course. This is pre-pandemic, so everybody's interacting very closely. But then we're measuring that and weighing that food waste to see what the ratios are between stuff that, like I said before, could be composted, recycled, or go to the landfill. Next slide, slide 25. And here's what that looks like. So from that big pile of trash down to, filling up 1.5, roughly probably one completely full 5-gallon bucket of food from one lunch period of 3 lunch periods. So it would be 3 times as much for that day this is New York Elementary. Next slide. Something that I had not thought about or predicted was that there was a significant amount of stuff thrown away that did not fall into this category of food waste as I was thinking about it. As you can see here, these are all unopened, untouched, unused items, except for the trays and the silverware and the pencils. So this was alarming because all of this food is packaged and being wasted and would have a longer shelf life. And I think the same thing for the apples and the oranges and the bananas that are pictured here. Next slide, slide 27. You can see here, we broke it down, and from this day, there was a total of, I believe, 81 pieces of silverware, 14 muffins, 20 unopened milks, 12 unopened string cheeses, 2 lunch trays, and then numerous juices, apples, oranges, and bananas. Also a theatrical mask and a few syringes for I believe it was we'd figured out it's for like diabetes medication. And so there's a lot of things going into this lunchroom garbage that really shows that, okay, this probably does need to be sorted. And also another consideration, which is a side note, is that what does it cost for a single school to be losing 81 pieces of silverware and 2 trays a day, if this is an average day? And then what are we doing throwing away all this packaged food and food that would have a longer life when we could be doing something else with it? These were questions that the students brought to the table. So here you go. Next slide, slide 28. If you throw, where do I go? So the students wanted to figure out how we could work on this and do something else to where students would be sorting food themselves. So next slide. You can see that here we have, I had imagined maybe a color-coded garbage can, and you can see a little bit the green behind the poster there, but the kids wanted to make their own signs for it, which was awesome. So this is compostable food. The next slide, slide 30, is landfill trash. And this got us on our way to being able to separate food, but we still needed to understand which foods go into which place, because for everyone, this is not common knowledge. Next slide. So I did some things along with building some basic curriculum materials for the teachers, like making little worksheets. So this is a hand-drawn worksheet that would appeal to the younger kids. And I made a bank of images and then a trash and a compost bin at the bottom. Next slide. And the idea is that students would go through and be able to take these images and match them up to where they're supposed to end up. This was really fun. This is Jasper's version of it. And this was a part of the process of helping students know how to sort their food. And as you'll see here, some of these things could be composted, but we're thinking about this specifically in terms of vermiculture, vermicomposting. So some foods that, yes, could be composted, but if they have cheese or meat, or if they're just heavily bread-based, we're not putting them into the compost. So you can see that here in this sheet. Next slide. But it wasn't a perfect system. And so we were still finding trays and mixed up things in there because we were asking a lot of these kids. You know, they're not thinking about this all day long like I was when I was administering this project. And so the kids are there and they're talking to their friends in line. And then when they get up to the garbage cans, they remember, oh, we're doing this project. They don't remember which thing's supposed to go in which. Kids behind them are being noisy and a little pushy. And so they just dump their tray. So we realized that we needed to have monitors with this. So I started spending my days at different schools in the lunchroom. We also had paras from the school district taking part in this and teachers volunteering their time as well as parents to help the kids go through and sort their food. Next slide, slide 34. And so we continued the food audit, at Free State for a number of days because I wanted to have more than a single day's representation of what was happening. So we did a full week of a food audit at Free State High so that we could have a little bit better numbers to understand what was happening. Next slide. And you can see here students were taking time out of their day, their study hall, to go through and administer this. So I had stepped back and watching students administer this. If you look on the left-hand side there of this slide, you'll see a bin that says share. Earlier, you saw the image of the food being thrown away that was vegetables, unopened milks, unopened juices, applesauces, string cheese, unopened vacuum sealed peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. So that's what's going into the share bin. This was proposed by the students that we would do this. One of the things that we learned is that actually a lot of this food was being thrown away because students had to choose to take either, I think, a fruit or a string cheese. And so, you know, that's not bringing into account that if kids are allergic to these things or anything else, with the idea that they're being healthier and they're getting some of this in their diet. But as you can see, a lot of it was being thrown away. Next slide. And here you see that share bin. This is from one lunch period. So I believe at Free State at that time, they had 3 lunch periods a day. So this is 1/3 of what's being thrown away of completely good packaged and natural foods, such as the fruits and vegetables. Next slide. And this to me was like a very happy point. You can see these kids being kids in line. It was so much fun to be in these lunchrooms. But this little guy in the green shirt is reaching over making his reach and putting these carrots into the correct bin for composting. The rest of his tray has already been cleared and dumped in the landfill or recycling. You can see the other kid with the cool haircut is doing the same thing. He's put his other food in landfill and he's getting ready to dump his peas. So this was like the image of success. So this is next slide, slide 38. This is where we started, right? We see a hamburger mixed in with things that could be recycled, mixed in with things that could be composted. So this is our messy view. This is a camera shot down into the garbage can. And so I'm just going to run through these next slides very quick and let you take them in. But this was like a very beautiful thing to me, that we went from seeing this in the garbage cans and then to seeing this. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Just letting you take these in. This was a very happy thing for me. Next slide, and we should be on slide 42. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. And next. So we're on slide 48 now. So, this was really beautiful because when I would go through then and be sorting this food at the end of the day, or the students would at their school worm bins, they had a very clean palette that they're pulling from to feed these worms, to feed the worm bins. And this was really nice because we were also working with some farmers who would take the food that we could not manage, that there was too much food for us to put into our worm bins. And the complaints that we were getting was that, hey, there's ketchup packets ending up in this compost. There's, forks and other things ending up in there. So when we got to this point of it being cleaned up, it was really great. And I think the students felt great about it as well. Next slide, 49. And at the same time, we're not just pulling from the garbage cans at the school, from what's left over from the lunchroom. We're also pulling from kind of the pre-lunch stuff. So this is stuff that cafeteria staff are putting aside because it's either out of date, is not going to be used by the next time they're using this food in a meal that's scheduled. Next slide. And you can see here in this picture, slide 50, that there's apple cores, a huge mix of things. This is, for those of you that are seeing this, I just want you to know that I was pulling, totes or boxes of this food, what you're seeing right now. This is coming from each school each day. So next slide. And right here, these red peppers, we all know that these can be a little spendy sometime. But again, these weren't going to be used in something. There probably wasn't adequate space to freeze them at the school. And so this stuff goes. And so the worms are eating very well, as you can see. Next slide. The image you see here is the beginning attempts at pre-composting. I began using this process after attending a worm conference in North Carolina. And yes, there is an international worm conference that happens every year. Many worm farmers were pre-composting to begin the initial breakdown of food and to eliminate some of the excess liquid that brought about pests such as mites and soldier fly larvae. And so this was really great. And it also, I haven't talked that much about worms, but the idea is that worms are not actually eating the food, they're eating the byproduct of the initial breakdown of the food. So if you can pre-compost a little bit, you heat everything up. And so you're getting rid of anything in there that you wouldn't want. We were usually getting, I think, to about 125 degrees. And this is slide number 52 that we're on right now. Sorry. So you should be seeing a compost pile with 1 day's, again, just a reminder, this is 1 day's food waste from one school that you're seeing on this pile. Next slide. So slide 53. And then I'm trying different things with the bins. And so I'm doing pre-composting. I'm following the rules of composting where you have greens and browns, nitrogen and carbon, and layering that. And so you can see that a little bit here, slide 54, and trying lots of different things. And so you can see some of the browns I'm pulling are from dead grasses. Oftentimes I was pulling from shredded paper. And sometimes I'm pre-composting, sometimes I'm putting food directly in, and I'm just kind of making my own notes on this and seeing what works best with the worm farm. And this is at Sunrise, which was previously Sunrise Garden Center, Sunrise Project. They were a great partner on this project. And in addition to hosting the worm bins, which I think there was The bin you're seeing right now on slide 54, there were probably about 12 bins this size hosting worms. I think at our highest point, we had a few hundred pounds of worms. And it was just really great to be able to have workshops with kids there. Schools would come on field trips. And this was the place where I was managing all of the food that I was bringing from the schools. Next slide, slide 55. And here you finally see what do the worms look like in the worm bin. They are very plump. They're rich in color. They're very active. They're dense. This is probably too dense. But as you can see from the initial maybe 100 pounds I got, and then spread it out through many bins, they have multiplied to 3 or 4 times what I initially had. Next slide, slide 56. And here you can see youth interacting with the worms. This is great. It was a great educational thing. Just a side note, what I found, and you know, there were, it was really interesting to see who was squeamish about worms, but overwhelmingly it was little boys that were the most squeamish about worms, which I just thought was an interesting thing to notice. But we did a lot of great projects. Next slide, 57. You can see that in addition to the work that we're actually doing with composting, it's generating a lot of material. So in math, in creative writing, in a lot of different ways, kids were doing projects about researching, using this as a way to talk about science through worms. It was really great. Slide 58, next slide. And here's another project that kids were doing at one of the schools. Next slide. Here's another project. Here it says that the question at the top, slide 59, do they have brains? This is about worms. Red worms have no ears, eyes, or lungs. They have an organ called a ganglia, which is like a tiny brain. So kids are learning these fascinating things and a lot of times educating me about worms. Next slide, slide 60. Here's a youth being interviewed by our local newspaper. Her grandfather actually is a small scale worm farmer just in their house, but he came to present that day. And so she is very knowledgeable about this and was giving a report that was partially published in our newspaper. Next slide, slide 61. Youth are using an opportunity, the worms, to do some creative writing. So here they're generating poems together. Some are making haikus, some are kind of free form poems. Next slide. And they're delivering the poems. And so this is an opportunity to present. This was really great. Next slide. And they're delivering the poems in another way, which is directly to the worms because it's paper, for the worms to actually consume the poems that they have written about the worms. And that will become the end product of our black gold or worm castings. Next slide. Here's one of the poems. It makes me so proud to be a worm savior. I love your wiggles. This is slide 64. Next slide, 65. Here you can see people interacting with the worm bin. I love this because what are they doing? They're touching the food that came from their cafeteria that they put out. They're interacting with worms. They're seeing how the materials have transformed into the worm castings. So this is really great. Next slide. Students working to actually harvest the worm castings and process them. So here they're putting them through a grate and we're actually harvesting the worm castings. Next slide, 67. And students working on worm bins so that they can take these back and either have them at home or in their schools. And so gave them kind of the basic instructions that I learned from looking it up online. And here they're working together with power tools at Sunrise Project to make these worm bins. Next slide. This is a significantly advanced worm bin that has a lot of components to it. This is at Free State High School that we built in a greenhouse. Ash Shadrick is the person who designed and built this. And students are going through and working their worm bin here, which eventually they administered without any support from me. Next slide, 69. This is really great. So the guy that you see here in the Adidas jacket, he is actually a student that learned this the semester previous at Free State High School. And in the spring semester, they had to have their own worm bin, a working worm bin, and they had to take it around to grade schools. And they were teaching grade schoolers about this process. So really great to see this transitioning from me helping to instruct students and those students helping to instruct the next generation of students. Really great. Next slide, 70. And here you can see students interacting with the worm bin. whatever bias they have going into it. This is a fully aerobic setup, and so there's no actual smell, but you can see this girl here holding her nose, which I think is very cute. Next slide, 71. And then the SARE component of this project was that one of the significant components of it was that I worked directly with Kevin and Jesse Prather at Mellowfields Farm. And so I'm constructing a bin here that's similar to the worm bins that we had, but this would be a test plot to see at different ratios, 10, 15, and 20% worm castings in the soil mixture as a soil amendment. How does that affect the growth of the plants that they were choosing to grow, which was mostly, I think, microgreens for local restaurants. Next slide, 72. Here is the end product, nothing fancy here. Made a sticker, put it on a Ziploc bag, filled it with worm castings. We would do 5-pound bags, and much of this got generated to the test plot. A lot of it was given away, and a lot of it was purchased by people that wanted either have it for their plants on a smaller scale. Some of it actually went to Colorado and was utilized to generate a worm tea in the correct way, which is they would utilize the worm castings and all of the beneficial microorganisms that existed within, and they would multiply those by feeding them sugar the same way I think you would, create beer or other things, and then they would feed that to plants they were growing there in Colorado. And then real quick, this is the end. This is kind of the little goofy logo that I developed and put my home phone number on, which still gets called once in a while about this project. But I just wanted to check in. I know I'm a little over time, so I'm just going to go through a couple things here. Through the education component of this project, more than 3,844 Lawrence youths ages 6 to 18 years old took part in these workshops, food waste audits, presentations, hands-on composting and vermicomposting. 6 Lawrence schools participated during the tenure of the Green Schools grants, with one remaining and ongoing project participating more than now 4 years after the grants had ended. Through this project, more than 8,100 total pounds of food waste sourced from 6 schools and 1 local grocery store was diverted from entering the sanitary landfill. Students learned what lunchroom items were and were not compostable. They learned about nitrogen cycle. They learned about industrial food waste, agricultural food waste during production, and about consumer food waste. Students were empowered in their role as active participants in affecting the waste stream and express this through presentations, posters, conversation, poems, and artwork. So I will stop there. This is slide 73. Sorry, Caitlin, if I left you behind on that one. And I will answer any questions anybody has. Thank you for receiving this presentation.
Well, thank you so much, Nicholas. That was great. And thanks for bearing with us through our technological difficulties. Does anyone have any questions in the few remaining minutes that we have?
I had one. Or if Joan, if you have one, you can go first if you want.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I was a edible garden manager for an elementary school out in Oakland. And same issues, they already had like a way to divide up everything, landfill and recyclable and all that. Like they had the bins, except they didn't have the bin for the like recovered food. And so that's a piece that always really interests me within work like that. We kind of were thinking about like a parent pantry so that parents could like recover the food directly from the school. They talked on that for a really long time because of procedure and all that kind of stuff. So, I ended up taking it to like the closest BART station in Oakland to just like give to people. And so that's how distribution worked there. So I'm curious, like with you all, like where, see all the stuff that was recovered, what was the like distribution line after that?
Yeah, thank you, Pantaleon. So that was a hard one for the students because they felt, like they could really affect change by taking that food that was tossed away and giving it another life. The reality is that there are, I don't know if it's through the school district or state laws that disallow for even students to share food. So this isn't just the recovery of food, but even to say, here's this thing I don't want, you can have it. I don't know how much that's upheld in schools, but the idea is that when you're looking at extremely low income students, or maybe students that aren't receiving proper food in their home life, well, of course, they could take this home. And now you have 3 apples, 2 milks, a string cheese that you can just take home and eat at your leisure. But that was more than we could tackle through this project. The other component was that there was something that was put into play by Michelle Obama, I believe, it was this thing that students would have to take either a dairy or a fruit element, which is great because it's promoting health. But in reality, the way it worked out is that students were throwing away a lot of that stuff. So there's something missing there between ideal and practice.
Food audits, trash audits.
Yeah. So there's, so it ended up being that we couldn't recover that food. The bins you saw were recovered, and I think the students did take that home and do things with it. But after that, administration kind of put the kibosh on that, and it wasn't allowed to continue recovering that food.
Yeah, I think the issue they ran into was literally the contract with US Foods. Like, I don't 100% quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure that was like their barrier there. But so for me, you know, I'd show up usually to I was part-time doing that. It's just kind of gig work, but to run that little garden. And I would just, like, you know, when they're sorting them, I'd be like, all right, remember, you know, like food's here. And then I'd ask them too. I'd be like, you sure you're not going to be hungry later? Do you like want to put that in your backpack, or like do you want? So like then they kind of started like realizing, oh yeah, I might want this later. And then like another kid comes up to me, and he's like, oh yeah, my brother was like, he totally was hungry later. And I was like, good. Like, so kind of making them aware of that too, and just like step them away from that, like you said, like that they're all told you can't share mentality, just to make sure they break away from that before they get too entrenched in that piece. But yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, excellent points. Joan, I think you're next, and then we have Allison who raised her hand.
I was just wondering how this has continued since the project ended.
Yeah, thank you, Joan. So initially it was funded both through the SARE Farmer Rancher Grant, and then also through Kansas Green Schools, which was a part of KDHE, which I mentioned. And together, those two funding streams allowed us to purchase the materials needed to facilitate this. It also allowed for my time. Eventually, this turned into a full-time job for me, with running to each school and monitoring lunch programs, collecting food. So the last thing I would do for about 9 months, the last thing I did every night before going to bed was I went to the back of Checkers. I picked up about 6 5-gallon buckets full of produce that they were putting out. I took it to the worm farm, cut it up, pre-composted or put that in with the worms, went home and took a shower and went to bed. And then I would start my day with going to one of the schools. So this really became consumptive for me, which was great. And so the next step was, well, how do we make this sustainable in terms of funding? And so I wrote about this a little bit in my grant report. But the Kansas Green Schools was taking a year off to reevaluate how they were going to distribute funding. My SARE grant was ending, and also wasn't designed to, focus on carrying this work forward. It had specific parameters. And so I wrote to the school board. I pulled all of the school board members together, laid out the complete project, what had been done, and said, here's what it would take to continue this. It would need essentially one full-time and one part-time staff person. And there was also considerations made to, if we're recovering this much waste, how does that change our relationship with HAM, who is the organization that takes care of all the garbage for the district? Could we make a deal with them, since we'd be cutting our waste for each school in half, where they're only picking up garbage half as often? That saves the school money. That would facilitate a position. Tried a lot of different things, and in the end, it just wasn't something that the school board could prioritize at the moment. And so all funding fell away. I continued the worm farm for another 6 to 8 months, and distributed the worms between people who were interested, gave away all the worm castings. And now I still operate a small worm farm at my house, but I bit off more than I could chew. And but to be honest, a program like this, if it could fund 1 or 2 staff people, could exist in a school district the size of Lawrence and be successful. And so that's something to consider for people in power and administration, that this can be done. And there's enough models like mine, and ones that probably cover things mine didn't. But I think it was really effective for the kids. It was cool to see the kids interacting with cafeteria staff in a way that they hadn't before, that made it feel collaborative instead of like a service component. So right now the worm farm exists in some totes in my basement. But all of this work, if anybody has any questions for me in the future, I'm happy to communicate everything I know and share all of the resources. I still have a Google Drive folder full of resources that I can share with anybody who's interested.
Thank you. And Allison, did you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Yes, well, he did a really good job of wrapping it up. So maybe all I was going to say is that probably 10 years ago, 8 years ago, I was working with a private elementary school in Lawrence, and I was running at the time about 400 chickens, and I would take the kids would separate it out, and it was a large preschool. There were a lot of classrooms and an elementary school. They would separate, they would do all of that separating. I would take it home and I would feed my birds, and then the eggs would go back. So there really wasn't any money exchanging hands, except that it helped me not have such a food cost for my birds. But there was no way to extend that beyond that school, because technically you're not supposed to be taking food waste and going directly to livestock. And so like you guys have said, there are some really significant challenges with regulations that make food waste hard to reclaim. But I agree. I think that a school district and perhaps private schools could all go in and pay for a portion of that person's position. I don't know, but I think it's marvelous. I think it's marvelous what you did.
Thanks. And there's other models. I'll just real quick that, the next step, as this was kind of on the precipice of whether it would fizzle out or pick up, was a model that actually Caitlin had pointed out to me, where we had talked to this guy, Eric Farnsworth, who's in Lawrence, that makes I don't know like altered bicycles. And so we were going to, how do we generate funding for this? So one of the things was a subscription program that would exist in the 3 neighborhoods closest to where the worm farm was located, Sunrise Project. And people would be able to, for $10 a month or something, have their compost picked up, their food waste picked up. We would then take that to the worm farm, do that. And then if they wanted to upgrade their membership, this was the idea, then in return, they would also get worm castings when those were available. And so that we were trying to imagine other models where, how do you make this sustainable if it's not going to come from a top down, from like the school district or a municipality? Is there another way that you could do, which would almost mimic, I guess, how trash services work or other subscription services? So I'll pause it there, but there is, I think it's in, Caitlin, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's Austin, Texas. There's a group doing that. Is that right?
I think so. I'll find the link and I can send it out in the Whova stuff.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Is there any other questions? Okay, well, thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate you allowing me to share this work. It was really lovely to do that, and it was really lovely to be able to do that work for a couple of years.
Well, thank you. And thank you both for these wonderful presentations. So inspiring. We just appreciate your time and energy and effort in your projects and the presentations so much. And also big thanks to SARE for funding these projects. They're just phenomenal. So we sure appreciate it.